what are the things in the 70s that you wish had developed and did not because it was ridiculed?
Well, I'm now giving the talk.
Well,
Maybe we can all turn to our neighbor and think about that together. You know, like what do we not do that out of fear of ridicule that we wish we could do?
Communism.
Okay. Even to bring up the term is a little frightening in public discourse. Yeah.
Well, I think it's something that plays out in all of our conversations with each other and all of our beings with each other. Always that hiding and fears of humiliation, and maybe we could just take care now to be more open and vulnerable and courageous when we speak with each other, speak with ourselves.
Hi, yeah, go ahead.
I think this is sort of related to Julie's question. But I wanted to say also about Julie's question, what Donald Trump is breaking through from his point of view and the point of view of his base is political correctness. That's the constraint that keeps politicians unable to say what they believe, right? And that liberal political correctness, we're not allowed to say that the Confederate heroes are to be honored.
If we think that.
Right. Okay, so I want to ask about something that's kind of related to that. In your talk, and even more in the book, you talk about social movements as sort of the great antidote to this alienation. And it's the movement of the movement that effects that. So I want to talk about a social movement that you didn't refer to. I suppose especially the 90s, and the 2000s, the aughts, or the whatnots, whatever. Which is when small groups of people gathered face-to-face gatherings on an ongoing basis to get to know each other, to care for each other, to support each other, to talk through their personal and shared life problems in a spiritual context, in the spiritual context of evangelical churches, and became the basis for the Christian right. So in some ways that shares a lot with what you're describing about the salutary aspects of social movements. But at the same time, it's in some way a very different thing happening. So can you talk about that difference?
So when I use the term in this book, I'm describing social movements that are the embodiment of love, fundamentally loving truth, human reciprocal presence. And if you're building a movement that's isolation, that demonizes others, that doesn't see the stranger as yourself, then there's something wrong with the unity that you're giving rise to. I mean, the Nazis would be the worst example, which had elements of the religious right. But of course, so my response is I don't want to judge these groups that you're describing, the evangelical groups, and I'm sure there was a lot of redemptive energy in them, but it got fused with a lack of caring about other human beings who were not part of the Christian right that reflects something lacking in, because if you don't universalize the communal spirit in you, then in some way you are dehumanizing others who you don't see as part of it.
And I think that that's the problem with all groups.
It's a problem with
groups on the
left.
left, obviously, Stalin, for example, where groups on the left lost their sense of community.
They lost it.
Or with
That
the
doesn't mean
demonizing.
they didn't have it.
But the same with
In
the
1917.
The same with the early, small evangelical groups start off very idealistic, but it's hard to. Those things are not very difficult to maintain in group. And all the groups of the '60s, there were aspects of it that could turn negative because they were still human beings.
I don't think it's because they were human beings. I think it's because they were as yet insufficiently evolved human beings who didn't understand this and didn't understand what was happening in the groups. That there's a specific residual and inherited fear that reasserted itself. It took a particular form of antagonism between two sides in the group that lead other people to watch from a distance and become fearful of entering that traumatic energy when they thought it was going to be loving energy, and leads them to calculate, leads all of us to calculate, I think I'd better go back to at least I felt safe in the mainstream reality that I was in. I could go back and get stoned and watch TV. Instead of stay in this traumatized, frightening, and the fear pools up in certain leaders who emerge and take over the group space, and leading others to gradually withdraw, at first by ones, and then by tens, then eventually by millions. So that is what I try to describe in chapter 9 of the book, but I just did describe a little bit of what I think our common experience was.
So how is that different from the redemptive energy in the early days of evangelical
Maybe
small
it isn't.
face-to-face community?
We've had evangelicals in the Tikkun movement,
Specifically conservative evangelicals.
Well,
How is that different from the tribalism of, left demonization of Republicans?
Oh, I'm against that too.
Yes, but what the question is,
I can't stand the fucking Republicans.
okay, but my question is, why does it have redemptive potential in progressive movements that it doesn't have in other countries?
Movements aspiring to a loving and caring world for all people. What's in my heart, I know exists in everyone's heart. Let's realize it in the world. We can do this. Any movement that is that, and that is their way of approaching the other, is what I'm for. I don't care about the label. I'm trying to describe the reality. It's what's the reality of the life force, psycho-spiritual communal life force being generated. And are we making it part of our knowledge? It's not just in our being, but also in what we know, so that we can strengthen our movements against our own internal dynamics that are likely to weaken and unravel it. That's why spirituality and politics have to be brought together. That's why they have to be married to each other as a single thing.
So first of all, I just want to say I resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I'm a psychotherapist. I've worked with people that struggle with exactly this. That a lot of what I did was talk to lonely people and help them reconnect, help them feel their feelings, relate to other people. The sense of alienation and isolation that you were referring to certainly is the world that I was addressing. They were people coming to me, so in a sense they were worse off. But I get that. And the relationship between an adversarial system and a mutuality system also makes a lot of sense to me. I was just reading some stuff by Gordy Feldman, who's at Brandeis. He wrote a book called Rambo and the Dalai Lama, about that very distinction that you're referring to. And unfortunately, I was trained as a lawyer too. So I get this adversarial thing, and I get how hard it is to move over into a system where you're actually real. And so I really appreciate all of that. I think the thing that I'm particularly concerned about now is what Tim Snyder is concerned about, that is the rise of fascism. And so the question here, I think, for people that are concerned about that, because I think that's part of what you're pointing to, right? That is, a leader will arise, which will allow other people to sacrifice their own individuality, right, in favor of the leader who's going to do something that makes them feel better, right? I mean, it's a very simplistic view, but that's part of what's going on here. So I think the question I would ask you is your approach to being more related, more mutual, is that your direction for all of us who are concerned about the rise of fascism?
Yeah, and partly, if you're asking me, I would
Yeah.
say, partly we need our forces, however we articulate who we are, to offer people something ourselves. What are we offering people who feel isolated, threatened, withdrawn, nobody cares about them? What are we offering them? That's my criticism of political correctness that Chaim referred to earlier. What are we offering the white working class in Michigan and Wisconsin?
Right, because part of my concern is that what the left was offering them was condescension,
Right.
right? And
Yes, I
that's
think so.
part of where we got into trouble, I think, right? So we need to back away from that and to
Right.
be genuinely empathic.
I agree with
Yeah.
that. Yes, I agree with that. Although I would say that I'm confused about the defense of the democratic institutions. That is a lot of the current discourse of what Trump is violating, is he's not respecting the institutional norms that keep the society safe, that make a democratic society safe. Do you know that?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very. I have a lot of my friends and conversations that I'm in. People are really think that's what is this key thing to protect the society. One of my friends who's German and whose parents lived through the Nazi era and who was a Maoist, as my friend was, and who's not anymore. He's a very strong defender of these institutions. And yet, to me, the institutions are embodiments often of inactive artificial existence. They are not oriented toward community, they're oriented toward formal democratic norms of people who are disconnected from each other. And so I'm unclear about that at the moment. I feel, perfectly open to the side that says, partly argue against Trump to defend those, but I also feel quite strongly that the Democratic Party has to offer something meaningful to people from a social point of view, something that's going to make them feel they are part of a community that cares about them, really cares about them, not baloney, actually cares about them and their fate and what's going to become of them.
More than their pocketbook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, and this might be too specific, when I hear what you're talking about the democratic norms and structures being too artificial, and I totally get that. But one of the things that pops into my head when I think about that is respect. That some of what I'm thinking about is some of the things that he doesn't go by, the structures, are so deeply disrespectful of norms, but some of these norms are the norms that I think are correct values. And those are structures that you have to hang your hat on, and maybe it's being too locked into structures as opposed to sort of, giving from inside. But I don't know, I'm not sure where to put that together with how do societies, they're so big, they have to have some structures to organize them. And I know, Julie, I think you were perhaps saying something about that, and so I guess I'm a little confused. about how you put that together. You
Well,
were
I-
talking about structures, alternatives to capitalism, but I'm now talking about structures in terms of societal norms, which is, you don't call this guy an asshole. You know what I mean? Like, what? You don't do that. Even if you think he's an asshole, you don't do that, because that's not what you do when you're the president. And that's a norm, I think, is a reasonable one. You know?
My distinguished colleagues and so forth. I mean, it's, I mean, it's ambiguous, I think, and I think you're making, it's a good point. I'm confused too. And I think maybe it's a matter of defending the institutional norms, but with the knowledge that they're not sufficient. And maybe the aspect of the institutional norms that actually are inherited wisdom
Right.
that could possibly be integrated with the transcendent aspect also. I mean, I'm thinking through this the same way.
That makes sense.
It seems like we're in a funny place where people on the left are rooting for this Republican Marine FBI guy to deliver the truth
Exactly.
to us. The left, where we used to think of relative truth, now we're saying it's only facts. We believe in facts. There's no alternative fact. We found ourselves on the other side of our own argument. That's all of a sudden.
I know, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about norms, and I've been, I have a couple of things. I keep thinking of Confucianism, and it's the respect that it shows for ritual, and for the idea that there have to be rituals of respect, and that the notion that there must be ways in which we respect one another. I just keep thinking that I wonder if the desire for mutual recognition is really mutual, in the sense that I think everybody wants to be recognized. I think that's universal. I'm not sure that there's quite as strong a desire to recognize, right? In other words, I'm not sure that the desire to recognize others is quite as strong as the desire to be recognized by others. And the desire to be recognized is, in a sense, a simple thing. The ability to recognize is a much more complicated thing, right? I mean, once again, we have a room full of people that none of us know. How would I go about recognizing anybody in a way that would satisfy their desire to be recognized, right? That is an enormously complicated question. And that's where, in some sense, these norms then come in, because what the norms ought to be are norms of respect. In some sense, you have to apply certain norms when you're surrounded by people you don't know, right? Because you don't know how to be respectful of those people in terms of who they are. You haven't gotten to know them yet. And so there have to be some sort of standards and norms. I guess what I'm winding myself around to is it seems to me the real complicated question here is how do we become recognizers of one another? And what is standing in the way of people being able to recognize others in such a way that they feel recognized? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's one thing. The thing you're saying is two things. I think that it's a relation of mutuality when we're here together. And I do think that it is possible beyond any ritual practice. I walk into the room, I see you, and I see you. Okay, I mean, you're human, I'm human. That's sufficient for the ground, without a knowledge of our mutual histories and the richness of the narrative of our lives, where we can connect up at points, and that could certainly deepen, add multiple layers of our sight of each other. But the ground and the basis of it is available to